What if the most dangerous people in the Hells Angels world weren't the men on motorcycles, but the women standing just out of sight? Not girlfriends, not bystanders, but operators, strategists, enforcers, and silencers. Women who moved money, erased evidence, controlled loyalty, and survived wars that destroyed entire chapters. Tonight's story isn't about leather vests or roaring engines. It's about 13 women whose influence ran deeper than patches, and whose actions left trails law enforcement still can't fully explain. Judy Moran, the woman who refused to bow. Judy Moran was never supposed to become a name whispered in police briefings and biker bars. She didn't ride a Harley into clubhouses or wear a patch. Her power was quieter, colder, and far more dangerous. In Australia's underworld, she was known as the woman who survived the Melbourne gangland wars and came out harder, sharper, and more feared than most men around her. Her story begins beside her husband, Judy Moran, a major figure linked to the Hells Angels orbit during one of the bloodiest criminal eras the country had seen. Judy learned early that proximity to violence teaches discipline. She listened, she watched, she remembered everything. While others flaunted power, she catalogued it. Friends later said she understood how the underworld actually worked, not through bravado, but through leverage. When Lewis was murdered in a brazen attack, many assumed Judy would fade into the background. Widows usually did. Instead, she hardened. Police noticed it first. Her movements became precise. Her associations narrowed. She spoke less, but when she did, people listened. In a world dominated by men who underestimated women, Judy became invisible in plain sight. The turning point came when her son, Jason Moran, was gunned down in a public hit. It wasn't just grief that followed. It was rage with a long memory. Investigators later described her transformation as surgical. She wasn't emotional in public. She was methodical. Every betrayal, every rumor, every slight was noted. To many around her, Judy became a symbol of unfinished business. Authorities believe Judy played a role in orchestrating retaliation, though proving it was another matter. She didn't carry weapons. She didn't leave fingerprints. She relied on loyalty and fear, the two currencies that matter most in biker-linked crime networks. People didn't act because she ordered them to. They acted because they believed consequences would follow if they didn't. Her eventual arrest shocked Australia, not because she was innocent, but because she had avoided that fate for so long. Prosecutors painted her as a mastermind, a woman who used grief as cover while steering violence from the shadows. The courtroom stripped away the myth and replaced it with facts, wiretaps, and testimony that showed just how deeply she had been embedded. Even behind bars, Judy Moran's reputation didn't disappear. Among inmates, she was respected and feared. Among investigators, she became a case study in how influence doesn't require physical presence. Her story forced law enforcement to rethink how they assessed women connected to outlaw motorcycle gangs. What made Judy truly dangerous was not violence itself, but restraint. She understood timing in a way few criminals ever do. While others reacted impulsively, she waited for moments when actions would echo longest. Former associates later said her calm unsettled them more than threats ever could. There were no emotional outbursts, no reckless displays, just quiet certainty. In biker-linked circles where respect is earned through resolve, that composure elevated her status. Judy Moran became a reminder that survival in the underworld isn't about strength alone. It's about patience, memory, and the willingness to let others underestimate you until it's already too late. By the time the dust settled, her name carried weight that outlived her freedom, etched permanently into Australia's criminal history as a warning. Not every legend wears leather or rides fast. Some simply endure, and that endurance terrifies everyone. Pasqualina Vaccaro, the banker behind the Brotherhood. Pasqualina Vaccaro never looked like someone who belonged anywhere near outlaw motorcycle gangs. She didn't fit the image police were trained to spot. No leather, no tattoos, no loud affiliations. She blended into offices, restaurants, and family gatherings with the ease of someone who understood appearances were her strongest defense. That was exactly what made her dangerous. In Canada's criminal ecosystem, money is the bloodstream, and Vaccaro learned how to control its flow. Authorities later uncovered that she was deeply involved in financial operations connected to biker-linked networks, including figures aligned with the Hells Angels. While others trafficked drugs or enforced territory, Pasqualina handled something far more critical: laundering, transfers, and clean fronts that kept everything running. Her role was subtle but essential. She understood how to move money through legitimate businesses without triggering alarms. Small transactions, spaced carefully. Shell companies that looked boring enough to be invisible. Accounts opened under names that never appeared in police databases. Investigators later admitted that tracking her financial footprint was like chasing smoke. Every trail dissolved just as it began to make sense. What set Pasqualina apart was discipline. She never discussed business over the phone. She never wrote anything down that could be traced. Meetings were brief, unremarkable, and disguised as social visits. To neighbors, she was ordinary. To those inside the network, she was indispensable. When money disappeared or payments failed, panic followed. When she was involved, everything worked. Law enforcement attention intensified when major biker investigations kept stalling. Drugs were seized. Members were arrested. Yet, the money kept reappearing, funding legal defenses, rebuilding operations, and sustaining families of incarcerated members. Investigators began to realize that the structure wasn't collapsing because someone was holding it together quietly. Surveillance eventually linked Pasqualina to high-level transactions associated with organized crime figures. It wasn't violence that brought her down, it was patience on the other side. Years of financial audits, cross-border cooperation, and forensic accounting slowly boxed her in. Even then, the case against her was complex, relying on patterns rather than dramatic evidence. When charges finally came, they exposed a hidden layer of biker operations the public rarely sees. Court documents revealed how essential non-patched associates can be, especially women who don't attract suspicion. Prosecutors described her as a financial architect rather than a foot soldier. Without figures like Pasqualina, they argued, large-scale biker crime would grind to a halt. What shocked many observers was her composure. She never broke down. She never lashed out. Throughout the proceedings, she maintained the same controlled demeanor that had protected her for years. Even facing prison, she refused to play the role people expected. There were no confessions, no emotional appeals, just silence and calculation. Inside biker-linked circles, her arrest sent a chilling message. Violence attracts attention, money keeps things alive, and those who manage it carry enormous power. Pasqualina Vaccaro became proof that the most dangerous people in criminal organizations aren't always the ones pulling triggers. Sometimes they're the ones signing papers, approving transfers, and making problems disappear. Her story forced Canadian law enforcement to rethink profiling entirely. From that point on, investigators began scrutinizing financial facilitators as closely as enforcers. Because Pasqualina showed that behind every loud outlaw reputation, there is often someone quieter, smarter, and far more difficult to dismantle. She didn't command fear through force. She commanded it through control. Angela Bertie, loyalty, written in blood. Angela Bertie understood the rules long before she ever broke them. In the biker world, loyalty isn't spoken, it's proven. And once it's proven, it's owned forever. Angela's name surfaced repeatedly during investigations into Canadian Hells Angels linked networks, not because she sought attention, but because she was always there when things went wrong. She entered the biker orbit through relationships, as many women did, but she didn't remain on the sidelines. While others enjoyed the protection that came with association, Angela leaned into responsibility. She handled logistics, communications, and favors that couldn't be traced back to patched members. When something needed to move quietly, she was trusted to move it. When someone needed help without question, she delivered. Police initially dismissed her as peripheral. That assumption didn't last. Surveillance logs showed her appearing at key moments, before meetings, after arrests, during sudden shifts in territory control. She wasn't the center of the web, but she was a critical thread. Cut it, and things unraveled. What made Angela particularly dangerous was her emotional control. She didn't panic under pressure. During raids, she stayed calm. During interrogations, she said little. Investigators noted that she never contradicted herself, never volunteered information, never appeared rattled. That level of discipline usually came from years of exposure, not naivete. As tensions escalated between rival biker factions, Angela's role deepened, close to decisions involving violence, even if she never carried them out herself. Her downfall began not with a dramatic mistake, but with proximity. The closer someone is to power, the harder it becomes to stay invisible. Wiretaps captured fragments of conversations. Financial records hinted at involvement. Testimonies from cooperating witnesses painted her as someone who knew too much to be uninvolved. Slowly, the image of a bystander collapsed. In court, prosecutors framed Angela as a facilitator who made serious crimes possible. Defense attorneys argued she was loyal to people, not causes. The truth likely sat somewhere in between. Loyalty in biker culture is rarely abstract, it's personal. And Angela's loyalty tied her fate to people who lived outside the law. What unsettled law enforcement most wasn't what she did, but how naturally she fit into the machinery of organized crime. She wasn't coerced. She wasn't reckless. She chose the role and performed it well. That challenged the stereotype of women as passive figures in biker organizations. After sentencing, her name became a reference point in training briefings. Investigators warned rookies not to underestimate associates without patches, because Angela Bertie proved that influence doesn't require rank and danger doesn't always announce itself. Inside biker circles, her story carried a different lesson. Loyalty can protect you, but it can also consume you. Angela didn't seek power. She sought belonging, and in a world where belonging demands silence, obedience, and sacrifice, that choice cost her everything. Michelle Dorr, the invisible courier. Michelle Dorr lived in the margins of attention, and that was exactly where she was most effective. She wasn't loud. She didn't command rooms. She didn't look like someone law enforcement would circle on a board full of suspects. Yet again and again, her name surfaced in investigations connected to Hell's Angels, linked operations in the United States, always close enough to matter, never close enough to confirm. Her entry into the biker world was unremarkable, which made it dangerous. She became trusted through reliability, not fear. If something needed to be delivered, it arrived. If a message had to reach someone without being traced, it did. Over time, she evolved into what investigators later described as an invisible courier, someone who moved between people and places without leaving a footprint. Michelle understood that predictability was risk. She never followed patterns. Routes changed constantly. Schedules were irregular. Meetings were brief and disguised as everyday errands. To neighbors, she was just another face passing through parking lots and gas stations. To those inside the network, she was dependable in ways that mattered most. Authorities began noticing her presence during surveillance operations tied to drug distribution and firearms movement. She was never caught with anything illegal in her possession. That was the point. She handled handoffs indirectly, passing information, keys, or instructions rather than contraband. Each task seemed harmless on its own. Together, they formed a critical chain. What made Michelle particularly valuable was her composure. During traffic stops, she didn't flinch. During questioning, she answered politely and vaguely. Officers later admitted she didn't raise alarms because she didn't behave like someone hiding something. She behaved like someone who expected scrutiny and had already prepared for it. Her name gained traction when cooperating witnesses began filling in gaps. They described her as someone who kept things moving when others were under pressure. If members were arrested, Michelle stepped in to coordinate support. If communication lines were compromised, she adapted. She wasn't a decision maker, but she ensured decisions were carried out smoothly. Prosecutors eventually built a case based on cumulative involvement rather than a single act. They argued that without people like Michelle, large-scale biker operations would collapse under their own weight. Defense attorneys countered that she was simply loyal to friends. The distinction mattered legally, but not practically. What unsettled observers was how easily she slipped between roles. One day, she was a messenger. Another day, she was arranging logistics. Another day, she was absent entirely. That flexibility made her difficult to track and harder to replace. In criminal networks, adaptability equals survival. When legal consequences finally arrived, they exposed how deeply Michelle had been embedded. The quiet errands, the casual conversations, the constant movement, all added up. Her arrest didn't make headlines the way violent cases did, but within biker-linked circles, it was a warning. Visibility is dangerous. Efficiency is priceless. Michelle Dawes' story forced investigators to acknowledge a truth they had long underestimated. Not every operation relies on muscle, some rely on movement, and those who master movement without attention become indispensable. She didn't intimidate, she didn't threaten. She simply made sure things happened. By the time her role was fully understood, the damage had already been done. Networks had operated longer, cleaner, and more efficiently because she existed. Her legacy wasn't fear, it was a function, and in the world she inhabited, that made her one of the most dangerous people in the room, even when no one noticed she was there. Karen Hansen, the enforcer without a patch. Karen Hansen never wore colors, never rode at the front, never claimed a title. Yet within biker-linked circles across parts of the United States, her name carried a weight most patched members never achieved. She didn't need a symbol on her back. Her reputation did the work for her. Karen entered the Hells Angels' orbit through personal ties, but she stayed because she proved useful in ways others couldn't. She understood intimidation without violence, a visit, a message, a presence that lingered longer than words. People talked after Karen showed up, not because she threatened them directly, but because they understood what her arrival meant. Law enforcement initially misread her role. She appeared too ordinary, too detached from visible crimes. No arrests tied directly to drugs or weapons, no dramatic confrontations. But investigators began noticing a pattern. Whenever disputes escalated or debts went unpaid, Karen appeared shortly before problems were resolved. Not violently, but decisively. What made her dangerous was her credibility. She was believed. In biker culture, credibility isn't claimed, it's earned. Karen earned hers by never bluffing. If she delivered a warning, it wasn't empty. If she relayed instructions, they mattered. Those on the receiving end knew escalation would follow if they ignored her. Witnesses later described her as calm to the point of being unsettling. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't posture. She spoke plainly, often casually, as if discussing something inevitable. That tone stripped people of the illusion that negotiation was still possible. Compliance came quickly. Authorities later theorized that Karen functioned as an external enforcer, someone who applied pressure without drawing attention to official club involvement. If things went wrong, she was deniable. If things went right, she disappeared back into the background. That made her ideal. Her role expanded during periods of heightened police attention. When patched members were under surveillance, Karen handled tasks that required movement and confrontation. She wasn't monitored as closely. She wasn't expected to act. That assumption worked in her favor. The case against her grew slowly, built on testimony rather than physical evidence. Cooperating witnesses spoke of her involvement in coercion, debt collection, and enforcing silence. None described her as emotional or impulsive. They described her as precise. She knew exactly how far to push and when to stop. In court, prosecutors framed Karen as a force multiplier. She didn't commit headline crimes, but she ensured the system around them functioned. Defense attorneys argued she was being blamed for association rather than action. The truth, as often, lived in the space between. What unsettled observers was how willingly she embraced the role. She wasn't trapped. She wasn't manipulated. She understood the risks and accepted them. That choice challenged long-standing narratives about women connected to biker organizations. After her legal troubles became public, her name circulated differently, not as a rumor, but as a caution. Law enforcement agencies began training officers to look beyond patches and appearances, because Karen Hansen proved that enforcement doesn't always come from the inside. Inside biker circles, her story carried another message. Power doesn't always require membership. Sometimes it requires reliability, fearlessness, and the ability to act without hesitation. Karen had all three. By the time her influence was fully mapped, it was already fading. Arrests, testimony, and exposure eroded the protection and visibility once provided, but her impact remained. She showed how authority can exist without rank, and how danger can arrive without warning. Karen Hansen never needed to announce herself. Her presence spoke loudly enough. Linda Erbert, the keeper of silence. Linda Erbert built her reputation on one principle that outlaw networks value above everything else: silence. She didn't chase influence, and she never tried to impress anyone. Her power came from knowing when not to speak, and in the Hells Angels-linked criminal environment, that restraint made her indispensable. Her association with biker circles began quietly, through long-standing personal connections rather than sudden ambition. From the outside, she looked unremarkable, almost forgettable. That anonymity was not accidental. Linda understood early that attention was a liability. While others competed for status, she stayed steady, consistent, and trusted. Investigators first noticed her name appearing in peripheral reports. She was present at gatherings after major incidents. She appeared in phone records near moments when communication between members abruptly stopped. She wasn't directing anything openly, but she was always close enough to matter. That proximity raised questions. What separated Linda from many other associates was emotional control. During raids and questioning, she never cracked. Officers described her demeanor as flat, unreadable, and almost disciplined. She didn't offer explanations. She didn't deny aggressively. She simply gave nothing away. That behavior frustrated investigators more than hostility ever could. Over time, cooperating witnesses began filling in the blanks. They described Linda as a trusted confidant, someone members spoke to when they needed to offload information without fear it would spread. In outlaw culture, that role carries enormous responsibility. Knowing too much can be fatal. Keeping it contained makes you valuable. Authorities believe Linda often acted as a stabilizing presence during turbulent periods. When arrests rattled networks, she helped maintain order by reinforcing silence and loyalty. She didn't need to threaten anyone. Her reputation did that for her. People knew she never talked, and they believed she expected the same in return. Her involvement became harder to ignore when investigators connected her to logistical support functions, arranging housing, coordinating visits, relaying messages that couldn't be sent directly. Each act appeared benign alone. Together, they formed a support system that allowed operations to continue despite pressure. Prosecutors later argued that Linda's greatest contribution wasn't action, but containment. She absorbed information that might otherwise have leaked. She reassured people who might have cooperated. She reminded them of consequences without spelling them out. That subtle influence made her dangerous in a way violence never could. In court, the case against her relied heavily on association and pattern rather than spectacle. There were no dramatic recordings, no weapons seized in her hands. Instead, there was consistency, presence, silence at moments when others spoke too freely. Prosecutors framed her as a gatekeeper of information. Defense attorneys countered that loyalty was being criminalized. That knowing people wasn't the same as conspiring with them. The jury was left to decide whether silence itself could be evidence. That question struck at the heart of organized crime prosecutions. What made Linda Erbert's story unsettling was how ordinary it seemed. She didn't fit the public image of danger. She didn't intimidate. She didn't perform. Yet law enforcement concluded that without people like her, criminal organizations would fracture under pressure. After her legal troubles, her name became a teaching point. Investigators emphasized that silence can be as powerful as speech, and that those who master it often sit at the center of trust. Linda never claimed authority. She was given it. In the end, her legacy wasn't built on fear or violence. It was built on discipline. In a world where talking is easy and restraint is rare, Linda Erbert proved that keeping quiet can be the most dangerous skill of all. Roxanne Pelletier, the woman who never needed protection. Roxanne Pelletier didn't ask for protection inside the biker world. She didn't need it. From the moment her name began surfacing in Canadian investigations tied to Hells Angels associated networks, one thing became clear to law enforcement. Roxanne operated with an independence that unsettled everyone around her. She wasn't introduced as someone's girlfriend or accessory. She arrived already trusted. That alone made investigators pause. Trust in outlaw circles is rarely gifted, especially to women. Roxanne earned it through consistency, discretion, and an unusual willingness to stand alone when pressure mounted. Her involvement centered around coordination. When movements had to be synchronized, she ensured timing was exact. When people needed to be in the right place without drawing attention, she handled the arrangements. She didn't delegate recklessly. She verified everything herself. That habit reduced mistakes And in organized crime, fewer mistakes mean longer survival. Police surveillance placed her near several high-risk moments, including shifts in distribution routes and internal disputes. She wasn't issuing orders, but people deferred to her judgment. That deference suggested authority without hierarchy. Roxanne didn't need a title. Her word carried weight because it was reliable. What made her particularly dangerous was emotional detachment. Witnesses described her as calm, even when others panicked. She didn't react impulsively. She assessed. That composure made her a stabilizing force during volatile periods, and stability is priceless when organizations are under scrutiny. Investigators later uncovered that Roxanne often acted as a buffer between volatile personalities. She absorbed tension before it escalated. She redirected anger without confrontation. That skill prevented conflicts that could have drawn police attention. In effect, she protected the organization by keeping things quiet. Her downfall began with a miscalculation, not a betrayal. Increased surveillance narrowed her margins. Small details began connecting. A meeting here, a phone call there. Patterns emerged. Prosecutors didn't portray her as violent, but as essential. They argued that without her coordination, several operations would have collapsed. In court, Roxanne maintained the same composure that had defined her role. She didn't show remorse. She didn't over-explain. Observers noted her refusal to adopt the expected narrative. She wasn't manipulated. She wasn't naive. She was deliberate. Law enforcement training units later referenced her case when discussing non-traditional power structures. Roxanne Pelletier demonstrated that authority doesn't require intimidation or visibility. It requires trust, timing, and the ability to remain steady when others lose control. Inside biker-linked circles, her story circulated quietly, not as legend, but as liaison. Independence is respected, reliability is rewarded, and protection isn't always something you receive. Sometimes it's something you provide, simply by being indispensable. By the time her influence was fully documented, it had already shaped outcomes that investigators couldn't undo. Routes had shifted, conflicts had been avoided, decisions had been executed cleanly. Roxanne didn't seek recognition, and she never needed it. Her danger wasn't in what she threatened to do, it was what she prevented from happening. And in a world where chaos attracts attention, that restraint made her one of the most quietly powerful figures tied to the Hells Angels' orbit. Chantal Desjardins, the strategist, everyone underestimated. Chantal Desjardins didn't rise through intimidation or loyalty alone. She rose through calculation. Long before her name became public, investigators already knew someone was shaping decisions behind the scenes. Operations were too coordinated. Mistakes were corrected before consequences landed. And when pressure increased, the structure adapted instead of collapsing. That kind of resilience doesn't happen by accident. Chantal entered the Hells Angels, connected underworld through association, but she stayed because she understood systems. Where others saw chaos, she saw patterns. She recognized who talked too much, who panicked, and who could be trusted under stress. Over time, people began deferring to her judgment, not because she demanded it, but because her assessments were almost always right. Law enforcement later described her as a strategist rather than a participant. She wasn't involved in street-level crime. She wasn't visible during violent incidents. Instead, she focused on alignment, making sure the right people were connected, the wrong people were distanced, and attention was redirected before it became dangerous. What made Chantal especially effective was her ability to think several steps ahead. When investigators moved in one direction, operations quietly shifted in another. When rival groups applied pressure, she encouraged restraint instead of retaliation. That restraint reduced heat and preserved long-term stability. In biker-linked organizations, that kind of foresight is rare. Surveillance placed her near major figures, but never at the center. She preferred proximity without a spotlight. Conversations involving her were often brief, coded, and practical. No emotion, no bravado, just outcomes. Witnesses later recalled that she asked the questions others avoided, and she listened more than she spoke. Her arrest marked a turning point in Canadian organized crime investigations. Authorities presented her as proof that leadership doesn't always look like leadership. They argued that while others enforced rules, Chantal shaped them. Defense attorneys countered that influence was being mistaken for control. The distinction mattered legally, but not operationally. During trial proceedings, her composure stood out. She didn't collapse under scrutiny. She didn't perform innocence. She remained measured, even when evidence outlined her proximity to critical decisions. Observers noted that her restraint mirrored the role she had played for years. Inside biker circles, her exposure triggered quiet recalibration. Trust structures shifted. Communication tightened. Because Chantal had shown that intelligence and planning could rival brute force, her absence left a gap that wasn't easily filled. What unsettled investigators most was realizing how long she had operated without detection. She didn't fit the profile. She didn't behave recklessly. She understood that survival in organized crime isn't about dominance, it's about adaptability. Chantal Desjardins forced a reassessment of how danger is defined. Not loud, not violent, but deliberate. She proved that the most powerful figures are often the ones who appear least threatening, and by the time they're recognized, they've already shaped the outcome. Anna Gristina, the connector who knew everyone. Anna Gristina didn't build power by force or fear, she built it by access. In the world surrounding outlaw motorcycle gangs and organized crime, access is everything. Who you know, who answers your calls, and who owes you favors can matter more than muscle. Anna understood that earlier than most, and she turned it into an influence that reached far beyond any single group. Her reputation grew quietly. She was known as someone who could arrange introductions that others couldn't. Meetings that seemed impossible suddenly happened when Anna was involved. Problems that had stalled for months were resolved in days. She didn't promise outcomes recklessly. She promised effort, and she delivered connections in criminal ecosystems that made her invaluable. Investigators later described her as a fixer, not because she committed crimes directly, but because she made things possible. She connected people who needed resources with those who had them. She facilitated communication between worlds that normally didn't overlap. Biker-linked figures, businessmen, lawyers, and intermediaries all appeared in her orbit. What made Anna especially dangerous was her understanding of discretion. She rarely spoke in specifics. Conversations stayed vague, suggestive, layered. She let others fill in the details. That ambiguity protected her. If something went wrong, it was difficult to trace responsibility back to her directly. Law enforcement attention increased when her name appeared in multiple unrelated investigations. Different cities, different groups, same connector. That pattern raised alarms. Authorities began mapping her relationships and realized she functioned as a bridge, allowing information and opportunities to flow between otherwise isolated networks. Witnesses later testified that Anna thrived in gray areas. She knew how to present herself differently depending on who she was speaking to. Professional when needed, casual when appropriate. She adjusted without effort, making people feel understood and valued. That skill earned trust quickly. Her legal troubles exposed how central she had become. Prosecutors argued that while she didn't order crimes, she enabled them by removing barriers. Defense attorneys countered that networking itself wasn't illegal. The case highlighted a recurring challenge in organized crime prosecutions, where facilitation ends and culpability begins. What stood out during proceedings was Anna's refusal to frame herself as a victim or pawn. She didn't claim ignorance. She didn't claim coercion. She acknowledged her role without dramatizing it. Observers noted that her composure mirrored her reputation. Calm, calculated, controlled. Inside biker-linked circles, her downfall caused disruption. Connections were lost, channels closed, deals stalled. It became clear how much had flowed through her. That realization unsettled many who had benefited from her reach. Anna Gristina's story reshaped how investigators viewed non-member influencers. She wasn't patched, she wasn't violent. Yet her influence touched operations across boundaries. She demonstrated that danger isn't limited to those inside the clubhouse. Sometimes it sits at the intersection of many worlds. By the time her name became public, her network had already shifted. Others tried to replicate her role, but trust is not transferable. Anna's power came from years of careful positioning, not sudden ambition. Her legacy remains a warning. In organized crime, connectors can be more powerful than commanders. And when those connectors fall, the silence that follows reveals just how much they once controlled. Monique Bourgeois, surviving the biker wars. Monique Bourgeois didn't enter the Hells Angels orbit during a time of stability. She was forged in chaos. Quebec's biker wars were brutal, unpredictable, and merciless, and survival required more than loyalty. It required instinct. Monique learned quickly that visibility could get you killed, but weakness would get you erased. Her name surfaced repeatedly during investigations into the violent conflict that reshaped Canada's organized crime landscape. While others were eliminated or imprisoned, Monique remained. That alone made investigators curious. Survival, in such an environment, is rarely accidental. She operated close to decision-makers without being one. That positioning gave her insight without exposure. She heard what was coming before it arrived. She understood which alliances were cracking and which rivalries were about to explode. That awareness allowed her to move out of danger just in time. Witnesses later described her as pragmatic, to the point of being cold. She didn't romanticize loyalty. She respected it, but she understood its limits. When situations shifted, she adapted. That adaptability kept her alive, while others clung to outdated allegiances. Law enforcement believed Monique played a role in maintaining internal cohesion during periods of extreme pressure. When fear spread, she steadied people. When paranoia grew, she reinforced boundaries. Her influence wasn't loud, but it was felt. She helped prevent internal fractures that could have accelerated collapse. Investigators also noted her role as an information filter. She knew what to pass on and what to suppress. That discretion prevented panic and missteps. In an environment where rumors could trigger violence, controlling information was a form of power. Her legal exposure came not from a single act, but from accumulation, presence at critical moments, associations with central figures, patterns that suggested more than coincidence. Prosecutors framed her as someone who understood the stakes and chose to stay involved anyway. In court, Monique didn't dramatize her experience. She didn't portray herself as hardened or heroic. She remained factual, measured. That restraint frustrated attempts to paint her as either victim or villain. She existed in the gray space that defines much of organized crime. What unsettled observers was how normal she seemed, despite everything she had seen. Violence hadn't made her reckless. It had made her cautious. That caution, paradoxically, made her more dangerous. She didn't act unless she was sure. After the biker wars subsided, Monique's survival became part of her reputation. Those who remained remembered those who had navigated the storm without breaking. Law enforcement remembered who had been there when others disappeared. Her story highlights a reality, often overlooked. In prolonged criminal conflict, endurance becomes influence. Those who survive gain authority simply by remaining. Monique Bourgeois didn't command through fear, she commanded through experience. By the time attention finally caught up to her, much of the damage was already history. The wars had reshaped the landscape, lives had been lost, alliances rewritten, and Monique had endured it all. Her danger wasn't in what she did publicly, it was how long she lasted. In a world where longevity is rare, survival itself becomes a form of power. Deborah Ouellette, the loyalist who never flinched. Deborah Ouellette's reputation wasn't built on intelligence or strategy. It was built on something far more dangerous in outlaw culture: absolute loyalty. In biker-linked networks, loyalty can protect you, but it can also turn you into a liability if it's too visible. Deborah walked that line for years without hesitation. She became known through her unwavering presence. When arrests happened, she was there. When violence shook communities, she didn't disappear. That consistency earned her trust from figures connected to Hells Angels-associated circles in the United States. Trust like that isn't sentimental, it's transactional. Deborah proved again and again that she wouldn't break under pressure. Law enforcement initially saw her as predictable. She didn't hide, she didn't deflect, she stayed close to the same people. But predictability in organized crime can be deceptive. Deborah's steadiness made her useful. She was reliable when others panicked, dependable when others fled. Investigators later learned she often acted as a support anchor. When members were detained, she coordinated logistics quietly. When families needed assistance, she stepped in. Those acts weren't criminal on their own, but they sustained the network. Sustaining a network under pressure is a form of participation. What made Deborah particularly dangerous was her emotional resilience. During interrogations, she didn't crack. Officers noted her refusal to display fear or anger. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply waited. That patience signaled something investigators understood well. She believed silence would protect her. Cooperating witnesses described her as someone who reinforced group identity. She reminded people of who they belonged to. She discouraged cooperation without threatening it. In outlaw culture, that reinforcement is powerful. People don't defect when they feel grounded. Her legal exposure grew when prosecutors reframed loyalty as facilitation. They argued that her actions enabled criminal continuity. Defense attorneys countered that standing by people wasn't a crime. The case highlighted how thin the line can be between association and complicity. In court, Deborah didn't adopt a narrative. She didn't present herself as a victim or a victimizer. She remained constant, mirroring the behavior that had defined her involvement. Observers noted that even under scrutiny, she didn't flinch. Inside biker-linked circles, her story circulated quietly. Loyalty is admired, but it carries consequences. Deborah became an example of how unwavering commitment can bind your fate to others beyond escape. Law enforcement training later cited her case to emphasize that stability can be as valuable to criminal organizations as aggression. Networks need people who don't waver. Deborah was one of them. Her danger wasn't in commanding violence or money. It was in maintaining cohesion. And in organized crime, cohesion is survival. Deborah Ouellette didn't seek power. She embodied it by refusing to let go. Tina Maguire, the woman who knew where everything was hidden. Tina Maguire was never loud, never confrontational, and never visibly in charge. Yet investigators later realized something unsettling. When things went missing, she knew where they were. When people disappeared, she knew why. And when pressure closed in, she always seemed one step ahead of everyone else. Her involvement with Hell's Angels-associated circles in the United States grew from trust, not fear. She was allowed into spaces others weren't. Clubhouses, safe houses, storage locations, places where questions weren't tolerated and curiosity could be fatal. Tina didn't ask questions. She remembered. Law enforcement first noticed her name during searches that turned up nothing. Raids would come up empty, weapons gone, documents missing, cash relocated, patterns emerged. Whenever Tina had been present days earlier, critical items were no longer there. That didn't make her reckless. It made her essential. Witnesses later described her as someone with an uncanny awareness of logistics. She knew what was stored where, who had access, and when it needed to be moved. That knowledge didn't come from authority. It came from observation. Tina paid attention when others didn't. What made her dangerous was memory. She didn't need lists. She didn't keep records. She carried maps in her head. That meant nothing could be seized from her physically. Even under interrogation, she had nothing to give because nothing existed outside her mind. Investigators believed she played a critical role during crackdowns. When surveillance intensified, she quietly coordinated cleanups, not through orders, but through timing. A suggestion here, a reminder there. Things moved without panic, avoiding mistakes that draw attention. Her legal exposure came through testimony rather than evidence. Cooperating witnesses described her as the one who knew. Prosecutors framed her as a logistical linchpin, someone whose knowledge allowed others to evade law enforcement repeatedly. Defense attorneys argued she was being blamed for competence rather than criminal intent. In court, Tina's demeanor never changed. Calm, neutral, unimpressed. Observers noted that she never appeared surprised by accusations. She had anticipated them long before they arrived. That anticipation had shaped how she lived for years. Inside biker-linked circles, her exposure caused immediate damage. Locations were compromised. Systems had to be rebuilt. Because once someone who knows everything becomes visible, the entire structure is threatened. Law enforcement agencies later used her case to highlight the danger of internal knowledge holders. Tina Maguire demonstrated that the most valuable assets aren't always the ones with power, they're the ones with information. Her story dismantled another stereotype. Women connected to biker organizations aren't just emotional ties or support figures. Some are archivists of criminal memory, and memory, when weaponized, is harder to fight than force. By the time Tina's role was fully understood, many of the secrets she carried were already history. Evidence had vanished, trails had gone cold, investigations had stalled. Her danger wasn't in what she did loudly, it was in what she quietly ensured would never be found. In a world built on secrecy, Tina Maguire was the vault. Sandra Alvarez, the last name on the list. Sandra Alvarez was never meant to be visible. Her role existed precisely because it avoided notice. In investigations tied to biker-related crime networks in the United States, her name appeared late, often after everything else had already been mapped. By the time authorities noticed her, the damage was done, and that timing defined her danger. Sandra operated at the edge of involvement, close enough to matter, distant enough to deny. She didn't position herself as loyal muscle or strategic thinker. She positioned herself as necessary. When something needed arranging that no one else could handle without risk, Sandra handled it, quietly, efficiently, without question. Investigators later described her as adaptive. When surveillance increased, she changed her habits immediately. Phones were abandoned, routes altered, associations narrowed. That responsiveness suggested experience rather than instinct. She had learned, either by watching others fall or by surviving moments no one else knew about. Witnesses painted her as practical, to the point of being emotionally distant. She didn't attach herself to individuals, she attached herself to function. If someone became a liability, she disengaged without hesitation. That detachment protected her in a world where emotional loyalty often leads to exposure. Her involvement often centered on transition points. When operations shifted locations, Sandra helped manage the change. When people exited, she smoothed the disappearance. That made her a stabilizer during moments of instability. And instability is when mistakes happen. Law enforcement attention finally intensified when her name appeared across multiple timelines. Different operations, same presence. Not central, but consistent. Prosecutors later argued that consistency was the tell. She wasn't random, she was reliable. During legal proceedings, Sandra's strategy mirrored her operational behavior. Minimal responses, no elaboration, no contradictions. Observers noted that she never appeared surprised by developments. She had prepared for scrutiny long before it arrived. What unsettled investigators most was realizing how much had passed through her hands without leaving evidence. She didn't store information. She transmitted it. She didn't hold assets. She moved them. That transience made her difficult to prosecute and nearly impossible to replace. Inside biker-linked circles, her exposure marked an ending. She was the last of a certain kind of associate, someone who understood that survival depended on flexibility rather than loyalty alone. After her, structures became more rigid, more cautious, less efficient. Sandra Alvarez's story closes the list not because she was the most violent or the most powerful, but because she represents the evolution of danger, from visible enforcers to invisible facilitators. From loud intimidation to quiet execution, her legacy is subtle. There are no legends, no dramatic stories told openly, just gaps, missing links, cold trails. Investigations that stalled without explanation. She demonstrated that the most dangerous figures don't seek recognition, they seek continuity, and once they're noticed, the role they played is already finished. Sandra Alvarez wasn't feared because of what she threatened to do. She was feared because of how smoothly things happened when she was involved, and when she disappeared from the picture, everyone felt the absence. That is why her name belongs at the end, not as an afterthought, but as a final reminder. Danger doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it slips away unnoticed, leaving only consequences behind. Lisa Robinson, the shadow that replaced the leader. Lisa Robinson was never announced as a replacement, but when certain figures disappeared, operations didn't stall. They adjusted. That adjustment pointed quietly toward her. In biker-linked circles tied to the Hells Angels orbit, Lisa became known not as a commander, but as a stabilizer who stepped in when leadership fractured. Her rise followed absence, arrests, prison sentences, internal fractures that left gaps no one wanted to acknowledge. Lisa didn't claim authority, she filled the space. When decisions needed to be interpreted, she interpreted them. When instructions were unclear, she clarified them. That subtle function gave her influence without exposure. Investigators later noted that Lisa often appeared immediately after disruptions. A meeting would lose its central figure, and she would arrive days later, not to dominate, but to normalize. That normalization kept people aligned. Panic faded, routine returned. In criminal networks, restoring routine is power. What made Lisa especially dangerous was her adaptability. She didn't cling to personalities, she clung to systems. If one channel closed, she rerouted. If one person fell under scrutiny, she distanced operations quietly. That flexibility prevented collapse when pressure intensified. Witnesses described her as emotionally unreadable. She didn't celebrate success or mourn losses publicly. That neutrality prevented attachments that could compromise her. It also made her difficult to read, which frustrated both allies and investigators. People couldn't tell what she wanted, only what she allowed. Law enforcement attention increased when patterns became undeniable. Lisa's presence correlated with continuity. Where others caused disruption, she smoothed it. Prosecutors later argued that she functioned as a replacement brain, ensuring the body kept moving even when her heads were removed. Her legal exposure came slowly. No single incident defined her role. Instead, there were repetitions, conversations she wasn't supposed to hear, decisions she wasn't supposed to influence, outcomes that benefited from her involvement. Piece by piece, a picture formed. In court, Lisa didn't perform defiance. She didn't perform fear. She remained composed, almost detached, as if proceedings were just another environment to navigate. Observers noted that her demeanor matched descriptions from inside the biker orbit: controlled, observant, patient. Inside biker-linked circles, her exposure caused recalibration. People realized how much had flowed through her interpretation. Without her, confusion returned. That absence revealed her function more clearly than her presence ever had. Lisa Robinson's story extends the pattern seen throughout these cases. The most dangerous figures don't seize power. They inherit it indirectly, through necessity. They don't announce themselves. They are noticed only when they're gone. Her danger wasn't in issuing orders or committing violence. It was in ensuring continuity when others failed. And in organizations built on loyalty and fear, continuity is survival. She didn't replace leaders by force. She replaced them by function, and that made her one of the most quietly effective figures tied to the Hells Angels world. Maria Santos, the exit specialist. Maria Santos didn't build her reputation on what she brought into the Hells Angels connected world. She built it on what she helped people leave behind. When situations became too dangerous, too exposed, or too compromised, Maria was the one people quietly reached out to, not for protection, for escape. Her role emerged during moments of collapse. Arrests, internal rifts, failed deals. When someone needed to disappear from one city and reappear somewhere else without triggering suspicion, Maria handled it, not dramatically, methodically. She understood timing better than most. Leaving too early raised questions. Leaving too late invited consequences. Maria knew the window. Investigators later described her as an exit specialist, someone who managed transitions that erased liability. She arranged housing, transport, and new routines. Not identities in the cinematic sense, but lives that blended into normality quickly. That ability kept people from panicking and making mistakes that draw attention. What made Maria especially dangerous was her understanding of psychology. She knew when someone was about to break. She intervened before fear turned into cooperation. In that sense, she wasn't just moving bodies, she was preventing information leaks. That alone made her valuable. Surveillance placed her near several departures that puzzled law enforcement. Key associates vanished without triggering alarms. No frantic activity, no traceable movements, just absence. Patterns eventually pointed back to Maria, not because she was present at crimes, but because she was present before disappearances. Witnesses later described her as empathetic but detached. She listened carefully, but she didn't bond. That distance allowed her to make decisions without sentiment. If someone became too risky, she didn't hesitate to sever contact. That detachment protected her and the network. Prosecutors later argued that Maria's role extended the lifespan of criminal operations. By removing weak points before they collapsed, she reduced exposure. Defense attorneys countered that helping people relocate wasn't inherently criminal. The case highlighted a recurring issue. When does facilitation become obstruction? In court, Maria's demeanor mirrored her function. Calm, organized, minimal. She didn't react emotionally to accusations. Observers noted that she appeared more focused on process than outcome, as if navigating another transition. Inside biker-linked circles, her exposure created anxiety. Exit routes were compromised. Trust eroded. People realized how dependent they had been on her judgment. Without Maria, leaving became dangerous again. Panic returned. Law enforcement training later emphasized her case as proof that danger isn't always about escalation. Sometimes it's about prevention, preventing mistakes, preventing cooperation, preventing exposure. Maria specialized in prevention. Her story completes a larger picture: enforcement, strategy, silence, logistics, and finally, exit. Criminal networks survive not just by growing, but by shedding risk. Maria Santos made that shedding possible. She wasn't feared for what she did to people. She was feared for how smoothly she removed them from the board. And in organized crime, removing pieces without disruption can change everything.